Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our rear brakes. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to remove all 5 of our 22mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Okay, now we have a nice clear view of our rear brakes. The first thing that I always like to do at this point would be to come right over here to where the ABS wire connects onto that flex hose. Carefully go ahead and separate the two. This is just going to give us a little bit of slack, so now when we go ahead and remove this caliper, we can set it aside. To take off the caliper, we're going to have to push back the caliper piston. That goes inside this area here. To do that easiest, I just use a nice pry bar, carefully get in between the caliper and the rotor that's behind that area, and then gently start pulling on it just like this. Now I can go ahead and move this caliper around. We can move along to the backside here and we can remove our 2 caliper slider pins. Now we can make our way to the backside here and we can remove our 2 12mm caliper slider bolts. There's one here, one located up a little higher. We're just going to go ahead and loosen that one up a little bit, and then we're going to make sure that we put it in just a couple threads. After that, fully remove that top one. Now we can go ahead and grab onto that lower bolt, fully remove that one as well. Carefully grab onto that caliper, remove it from the area. Once you have it off, just take a quick inspection. You want to see if you see any fluid. If you do, more than likely you have a caliper leak and you need to replace the caliper. This one looks fine, so I'll set it aside. With that out of the way, let's continue on to removing our brake pads from the area. I just push them right on out. Give it a quick inspection. You just want to make sure it's not wearing at an odd angle. Remove this other one. Once you have both those off, go ahead and grab onto the tins that are located on the bracket as well. We can set all this aside for recycling. With all that out of the way, let's continue on to our 2 21mm caliper bracket bolts. We're going to remove these the same way as we did the others. Just go ahead and carefully remove this one, put in a couple threads. Inspect your bracket, set it aside. Grab onto that rotor, remove it from the truck. With the rotor off of there, the next thing you want to do is clean up the mating surface on your axle where the brand new rotor is going to sit. I'm just going to use some parts cleaner and a nice brush. We'll get it nice and clean. Also, since we're cleaning things, now's a great time to go ahead and take a look at your emergency brake shoes, which are located behind the rotor. Just make sure there's plenty of meat, and then after you're sure that they look good, go ahead and clean them down with some parts cleaner as well. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and clean up the caliper bracket. The areas that you want to pay attention to are these areas along here, essentially where those caliper tins are supposed to go. You can tell I have a lot of debris on this area, or buildup, I guess you could call it. We just want to go ahead and sand that down. You can use some sandpaper, a little cookie, or even a wire brush. Okay, this side looks perfect. Do the exact same thing on the other side of the caliper bracket. Now that we have both sides of the caliper bracket nice and cleaned up, let's go ahead and turn it upside down and pay attention to this area in between here, which is where that rotor is going to go. You want to make sure it's clean and free of any buildup or debris that might be in there. I'll just use a wire brush. At this point, the caliper bracket's fully cleaned, so I'm going to continue on with some high temperature caliper grease, and I essentially just want to put this on the areas that I just went ahead and cleaned. This is going to help make sure that no rust or anything develops in this area, which of course would restrict the flow of the brake pads in this area. Moving along from the bracket, it's time to start talking about the caliper itself. For the caliper, you remember that we went ahead and we pushed in this caliper piston. You just want to inspect it, make sure it's all the way in. If it isn't, go ahead and use some caliper pliers and squeeze it in until it's bottomed out. After that, we're going to continue on to removing our 2 caliper sliders. To do this, I'm going to carefully press with my thumb and try pushing it out through the other side. I can go ahead and draw that boot away. All right, so now that we have that slider pin out of there, the areas that you want to pay attention to is, of course, the entire shaft right here. And then along each of the sides of this, you're going to find a little cut in right there. That's essentially the areas that this boot is going to be sitting into. So you need to make sure those areas are clean and free of any debris as well. That's going to make sure that no moisture or debris can make its way inside and clog up that slider pin. All right, so I cleaned up both of those slider pins. The next thing we're going to pay attention to is the boots themselves. For the boots, what you want to do is just make sure that they're nice and soft and pliable and they don't look like they're torn or worn or damaged in any way. If you see any tears, you need to go ahead and replace these. All right, both of those look good. The next thing that I always like to do is just try to clean out the inner aspect of these. When you do that, you don't want to use a parts cleaner because it could swell the rubber. Just go ahead and take a rag, try putting it through there, and then just bring it back and forth a few times. Now let's take some caliper grease. We're going to put it right inside here. Essentially, I'm trying to make sure I coat this entire area along the inner aspect of the boot. That's the area that the slider pin is going to be hitting up against the most, so it needs to be well lubricated. Let's put some of that caliper grease right on our slider pins, remembering that, of course, we want to make our way up into each of these grooves along both sides of that slider pin. Super important to help make sure we keep moisture out of the area. Now, this is probably going to be the hardest part of the whole brake job, and that's essentially getting this slider pin started. Generally, I just come in at an angle, start it in there. Once it starts in, I can just go ahead and grab it like this, and then carefully start pushing it through. You'll see it come through the other side. And now just work it back and forth. Essentially, we're trying to make sure the boot gets into the grooves on both sides of that slider pin. After that, do the exact same thing on the other one. Let's continue with that caliper grease. We're going to go right along the metal aspect of this piston right here, the center area. After you've coated that, continue on along the back side of each of these ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. With the caliper out of the way, let's go ahead and apply a thin amount of copper never sees along the mating surface of the axle where the brand new rotor is going to sit. Now the next thing that we're going to do is get ready to put the rotor on, but before we do that, I just want to mention about the emergency brake adjuster. That's going to be located right inside this area up along the top of the e-brake shoes. Now this adjustment is going to be very important for the emergency brake operation. So of course you're going to want to make sure you have this just right. Essentially what we want to do is go ahead and slide the rotor on, and then you're going to have to adjust this wheel in one direction or the other to be able to adjust the shoes out or even back in, depending on how much drag you need. Essentially, you just want to have it so the shoes are just barely touching up against that rotor, and then back it off one click. To do that, you can use a pry bar right in through the back. If you were to look right here, you can see that there's a little rubber boot that portrays through. Just go ahead and pull that out, and you can make your adjustment with your tool from the back. Now we can go ahead and put on our rotor. The next thing I always do is just use a spacer of some sort and one of my lug nuts, and I just put it on here to hold the new rotor on so it doesn't wobble around on us while we continue. Now let's go ahead and clean up the threads on all of our mounting bolts. Alright, I cleaned the threads and I put on some red thread locker. Let's go ahead and hold on to those caliper bracket bolts, grab the bracket, and start installing it. We'll just carefully slide that into position, take our two bolts with that red thread locker, we'll start each of these in, bottom them out, and then when we torque these, we're going to torque them to 132 foot-pounds. Next, it's going to be time to put on our caliper bracket tins and our rear brake pads. For the tins, we're going to have them in this position so that this little flip is facing up and it's kind of facing towards where the rotor is. Put this right on here as well. Now typically you're just going to have to hold that upper tin on there. Next, we're going to start putting on those brake pads. For that, you can see that they each have ears on either end. They just go ahead and slide right in here. There we are. That one's in. Now you just want to check it, make sure it can flow around easily. If you have to hammer this in, that means you didn't clean up the bracket properly. Go ahead and do the same thing to that outer pad. And you just have to lift up on the little tabs right along here so you can slide the pad under it. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and install our caliper onto this. What you want to pay attention to is along the lower ear on this, you're going to have a little tab that needs to fit underneath the bracket. So when we put this on, just go ahead and slide that underneath the ear of the bracket. Start in both of your caliper slider bolts with that red thread locker on them. Bottom these out. Once you've bottomed them out, go ahead and torque these to 24 foot-pounds. Resecure your ABS wire to your flex hose. Inspect your flex hose. Make sure it's not twisted in any way. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Let's get the wheel on here. At this point, we're going to start on all of our lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then torque each of the lug nuts to 130 foot-pounds. Okay friends, we got one side of the rear brakes done. What's left to do now? Now you want to do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, go ahead and climb inside that passenger compartment and pump up the brakes till it's nice and firm. Once you've done that, pop the hood, get under here and double check your master cylinder. That's where that .3 brake fluid's going to be. If it's low, go ahead and top it off to the maximum line. Close the hood, take it for a road test.